Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. We appreciate you taking some time out of your Friday to spend with us and listen and learn. This is our last Friday forum for 2022. So if you've come to other ones, thank you so much. We appreciate that. If this is new to you, welcome. We hope that you hear some things that you learned that are new today and just enjoy the program. Now I'm going to hand it over to Laura and she's going to get us started.
Hi, everybody. My name is Laura Swanzarek. I'm the Commuter Production and Advocacy Coordinator at Downtown on the Go. I want to sincerely thank you for being with us virtually today. Downtown on the Go is the advocate and resource for all things transportation in Tacoma. You can learn more about us at downtownonthego.org. I want to let you know that there is automated closed captioning available on Zoom. Just click the CC button at the bottom of your screen to turn on the captions. For our 2022 forum series, we've been exploring the question, what does it mean to be home in Tacoma? By diving into the link between housing and transportation. Today, for our final forum of 2022, we'll be discussing how sustainability work is connected to housing and transportation policies. There will be a Q&A section at the end of the forum. You can submit your questions at any time using the Q&A function on Zoom. You don't have to wait until the end. You can add them in there at any point. This forum is being recorded and it'll be shared out on Downtown on the Go social media accounts. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator, Tunisia Jumper. Tunisia is the Media and Communications Director for the City of Tacoma. All right, Tunisia, go ahead.
Hi, Lauren. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Can't believe we're at our third Friday forum already for the year, and that this is our last time getting to talk for a while, but so excited to see so many people here with us today, and cannot wait to introduce you to the wonderful guests we have. So if my guests could turn on their cameras, we're gonna get started because we got a lot of stuff to cover today. So hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I've been having a little bit of trouble with my audio, but just want to start the conversation. So I would like to introduce you to my panel, and I'm going to ask everyone to introduce themselves, where they come from, and a little bit about how you're connected to sustainability work. And I'm going to start with Mariana.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. My name is Mariana Sanchez Castillo. My pronouns are they and she. I'm a field organizer and I work for the Washington Environmental Council and Washington Conservation Voters. Both of those are statewide organizations doing environmental policy and electoral work. So today I'm here as WEC, Washington Environmental Council, and I'm connected to sustainability because I work a lot on state policy, and especially this year, I was working a lot on the Growth Management Act and updating this act to include a few different bills that would make growth in our state more responsible and more apt to the impacts of climate change, giving us a more sustainable future here in our state. So yeah, should I pass it back to you?
Yep, thank you. Kristen Lynette.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out today. I'm Christy Lynette. I work for the City of Tacoma's Office of Environmental Policy and Sustainability, and have since the City Council created that office almost 13 years ago. And clearly sustainability is in the title of our office. So yeah, work very closely on a whole range. My job is, I feel like when I share what I do for the city, I get to say like all the fun things that a city can do, all the cool programs and projects. One of the more recent ones is that City Council just adopted our newest climate action plan late last year, and I was the lead staff on working with partners and community on developing that plan, which certainly has a lot of land use elements embedded in it. Thanks, Tanisha.
Thanks for being here. My good friend Marquise, you want to introduce yourself?
I would love to. Hey everybody, my name is Marquise King Mason. I'm an organizer with Communities for a Healthy Bay, and that's why I'm here today. I do a lot of climate work as well. I was really blessed to help Christy out with the climate action plan in my official capacity. And yeah, I organized the Sunrise Movement for a long time, so I'm really focused on how do we kind of transform our society and economy to be like low carbon and just at like every level of both society and government. So while I work pretty locally, a lot of my work is kind of about visioning for how we really change hearts and minds when it comes to saving our planet. That's the paramount issue that I feel like a lot of us are coming into realizing that we're facing right now. So I'm really happy to be here with y'all, and thanks for having me.
Glad to have you here with us today too. And my colleague, Steve Atkinson from the city.
Great. Thank you, Tanisha, and great to be here. Welcome to everyone who's here in the audience. Wonderful to be part of just a great panel today. I'm Stephen Atkinson. I'm a principal planner with City of Tacoma's Long Range Planning and supervisor for the Comprehensive Planning Group at the City of Tacoma. Have had the pleasure to really work with Chrissy since she started at the city and be able to say we've been working kind of hand in hand, for the past 10 years or so, last decade, and really excited to have been part of the work on the climate action plan. For me, more directly, what we manage in my group at the city is the city's comprehensive plans. We work with our community members, we work with the city council, with citizen boards and commissions to craft the city's long range policies for how we want to address a range of topics, from economic development to housing to transportation and land use within the city. And I'll say that doesn't make us experts on economic development or any one kind of focal group within the comprehensive plan. But part of our role is to really think about the relationships between how we plan for housing and how we plan for transportation, how that relates to economic development. So we look at those connections and the relationships, and that's a lot of our focus within the city. And I'll end there and save some of the rest for some of the next questions.
Right. Well, I've had the pleasure of working with both Christy and Steve as we rolled out 2025, and I know a lot of these conversations are really related to what we want this community to look like in 2025, and the learning about the comprehensive plan, and me and Christy working on STARS and how do we integrate the STARS work into 2025, and some of these things we talk about complete compact communities and all of that stuff all comes from this kind of nexus between creating a livable, healthy community and one that will be here for beyond us, all the people on this call. So, this is a really important conversation today. I am going to ask my panelists to, when you get a chance, to explain things like what is a comprehensive plan and, what's the Growth Management Act, but we'll get into that all in a little bit. So, we'll start with the first question. How do you see land use and sustainability intersect in your work? And maybe just elaborate a little bit on what happens when you don't consider both. So let's start with Christy.
Well, I mean, so much of sustainability is really around how we plan, where we live, work, and play. And I'll just say that, and so much of that is how we get to all of those places, where they're located in relation to one another. So the city's greenhouse gas emissions, the majority of them come from our transportation. And, that's not only short trips, ones that in theory could be taken on a bus or a bike or walking, but longer ones too, where people are having to travel really far to get to work or to be able to afford housing. And so really looking at how can we reduce the need to drive is one of the essential pieces that we need to tackle if we're going to be looking at reducing our carbon pollution and creating more livable cities. We also need to be electrifying that transportation when we do need to either get in a car or for trucks or buses, certainly, but we also need to be looking at ways that we can design our cities and our region to not need to get in those cars as often. And also just the built environment. So that's the second largest piece of the carbon emission pie is our buildings. And so how we're designing and developing those also has a really key influence on our carbon emissions as a city and a region. So I just think that it really is so connected to the work that we're doing. And it's nice to have, some of this data to really be able to show where our biggest emissions are coming from, where those biggest opportunities then to reduce them are, and that so many of the solutions have not just climate benefits, but other benefits that are so important. It's, the health and safety and livability, all these great things that we also want. We can have that, and we can have climate, a climate safe future. So I just think that they're so connected, and it's so nice to be on a panel like this where we are really explicitly trying to show how all this really does fit together, and that we need everyone participating and, playing a role in how these decisions get made.
That's great. I think sometimes we try to separate things out too much. And I think things like sustainability and equity should be incorporated in all the conversations we have. And we shouldn't be, whatever we're pushing forward should be under the thinking about, well, what does that mean for our future? How are we building this in the most sustainable way possible? And who gets to benefit from it should always be at the core of our conversation. Mariana, I'm going to invite you to talk about that. And if maybe you could talk a little bit about the Growth Management Act and how that is related to it as well.
Yeah, thank you. So like I mentioned, a lot of my work that relates to land use and sustainability is through a statewide lens, and the effects that statewide policy, like the Growth Management Act, has on how our counties and cities plan for growth. So this is new to me. I'm not an expert, but yeah, I was really involved with the Growth Management Act, different bills to update it. So this act was passed in the 90s, so it's, has over 20 years, and it is basically a framework or guidelines to how cities and counties should plan for development and urban growth. So a lot of my work has to do with making sure that that framework includes climate action and climate resiliency, so that our cities and communities can plan and mitigate the impacts of climate change right now. So we've seen that climate change is real and it's happening right now. And we've had floodings and wildfire smoke and heat waves, all of that in the last year, that have really, I think, opened a lot of people to the idea that climate change isn't so far in the future, and it's really hitting us right now, and that we're not prepared to deal with it right now. And our cities are pretty vulnerable to it. So I think it's very important that people understand how land use can be this tool to, like you were saying, with an equity and climate resiliency lens, to make sure that we are looking to the impacts now and the future of the climate reality that we will be living in, with more extreme weather events happening more and more.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. So Steve, I'm going to jump to you because I think I want you to answer the question, but I also want you to talk about how the Growth Management Act, there's the statewide impacts of it, but then what does that mean for a city, especially when we are considered one of the growth centers? And then how does that, obviously you're working in land use every day, so.
Yeah, and working in it every day means that there's a lot of ways that we could, talk about, this question, which is great. But I'll try to kind of stay focused. So a couple key things, I think, Tanisha, to your kind of secondary question. I want to say, sustainability doesn't start or stop at Tacoma's jurisdiction. And that's kind of one of the fundamental reasons why we have a Growth Management Act, is because the success or failure of any one community is going to be partly dependent on what everybody else is doing within the Puget Sound region. So transportation issues don't stop at our borders. Housing markets are regional and affect affordability and displacement all across the region. And so as a city, we do what we can within our jurisdiction. But part of the point of Growth Management Act, and then more kind of regionally through the Puget Sound Regional Council and Vision 2050 is to make sure that every jurisdiction in this region is working together to craft a growth and development vision that is supportive of our goals to achieve sustainability, to support overall community health and well-being, and that has clear roles and responsibilities for everyone across the region. And so that's sort of one of the things I would kind of start with, is that Tacoma fits within that framework. And within that, you know, we are expected to be essentially like the metropolitan city of the South Sound, and to be that focal point and play that role. And that's a really significant role, but it also means, you know, a significant amount of change for the city. And so as a city, I often kind of think about, you know, Tacoma today is a Tacoma that we've inherited, you know, and there's an historic context and a grounding. There's also things that are very difficult to change about the way a city has been created. As a planner, you can walk around the city, and probably other people have noted these same things, and you can see, you know, development and changes in the urban environment that are based on different time periods of when things were built and the conditions of the time. So we tend to see it as a city that we're working, you know, kind of on a trajectory of trying to help the city kind of go from where it's been to determine where we're trying to go, and then how do you guide that trajectory of the city to get to that end result. And then I guess lastly, what I would, you know, kind of point out on just on this question is, you know, there's specific types of, I think, principles regionally that really kind of flow down to the city of Tacoma. So guiding growth to where we already have mass transit, to where we already have walkable neighborhoods and walkable communities. So really trying to orient growth to where we have those amenities in place. And so within Tacoma as well, you know, that's part of our framework. It's not going to be growth equally everywhere, but focusing growth in very specific ways, and different neighborhoods have different roles to play within that framework. And part of that means, you know, we also as a city want to maintain open space and nature, some of our community and historic resources. So again, we feel like there's a lot of room to balance a lot of those principles and considerations within the city.
Yeah, thank you for that. Marquise, I'm going to invite you to answer the question too, but as someone who's worked a lot with young people and as a young person yourself, you know, what these, you know, Steve mentioned inheritance, and as the inheritor of some of the good and bad decisions that have been made in the past, and someone who eventually will be leading this community into whatever the next version of it is, you know, how do these things kind of mesh for you?
Yeah. Well, disclaimer, I'm actually the second youngest on the panel. My bestie Mariana takes the mantle, but I do work a lot with young people, especially in my both volunteer hours and my day job. Yeah, so I think I'm trying to think of which angle to tackle this from. So I think, you know, in my work with Communities for a Healthy Bay, we kind of lead the charge on stopping fossil fuel expansions in Tacoma, and that comes from a number of industries and areas. We were successful in passing one of the strongest fossil fuel bans on expansions for a city that has actual fossil fuel industry in basically the entire United States. Steve Atkinson led the charge on that as well from the city side. From the advocacy side, you know, we're constantly trying to empower young people to take the future in their own hands, especially with these really important decisions around what kind of industries do we want in one of the largest, you know, industrial areas in Washington State. What kind of fuels we want produced, right? And so my work I know I'm kind of jumping the gun a little bit, but my work intersects with transportation so much because, you know, we are so reliant on these industries that the government regulates to also be our solution to the climate crisis, especially when it comes to transportation fuels. And so it takes a lot of coordinating and getting a lot of diverse stakeholders at the table, like young people, right, who can kind of speak to that passion of like, I don't even know if it's ethical for me to have children, right, on a dying planet. And that's like a really tough question. And I think a lot of people, especially decision makers, have to own up to that. And so, you know, those are some of the only people that can influence these industries, right? Because I can't go to, you know, an oil industry and beg them to create cleaner fuels. I mean, if the market pushes them that way, they'll do it. But, you know, our local government and our state government has the power to kind of push us towards that. And so I think having young people at the table is really essential if we want to have sustainability kind of interconnected through society.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just such an important point of there is the right now, and then there is the future. And what I need from the city of Tacoma in the future might be different than what you need from the city of Tacoma in the future, what Mariana might need in the future. And there might be things that Steve and Christy and I need from it in the future that are different than what you need. And without having everyone at the table to have these conversations, we will inevitably miss things. And I think that's the point of having these conversations, and why I keep coming back to host this Friday Forums, because I love having these conversations. So Marquise, you brought up transportation, and we know that transportation is one of the leading kind of things that influences sustainability, but it's also one of the key things that make a community work or not work for certain people. And for the people who have been with me for the other Friday Forums, we've talked a lot about transportation and the cost of transportation, either in resource or time. And now we're talking about the cost of transportation as it impacts the planet and our community. And so want to ask, how does transportation tie in this conversation, and how can we make more sustainable choices related to transportation? And I'm going to start with Steve on this one, because I like you. No, I'm playing.
No, thank you. And I guess as a planner, I guess I should preface this that we probably tend to see conversations around transportation really resulting from the sort of the land use basis. And so what I mean by that is often if we're talking about, commute trip reduction or vehicle miles traveled, many of those kinds of issues, which are part of what generates a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions within our community. It generates a lot of other unhealthy, impacts to communities by spending so much time and being so dependent on SOVs, single occupancy vehicles. But we tend to see that flowing from, the land use characteristics of the region. And so by that, what I mean is one of the wicked problems we face is the disconnect between where people live and where people work.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of reasons for that. And that is a really challenging issue to resolve. And it's not something that the city can resolve all on its own, but it's a fundamental disconnect within the region. And so then a lot of the conversations around mass transit, how do we get people to Seattle, rather than how do we get people around our own neighborhoods and our own community, become like a give and take and sometimes a zero-sum game of, with finite dollars, where do you spend that to get people to Seattle or to get people more connected within their own communities? So those are really challenging, aspects, but that's where a lot of the transit-oriented development conversations come from is, kind of two policies that we have as a city. One is to focus new growth where we have that transit. But again, that's largely focused on kind of reinforcing that disconnect that we got to get people to Seattle, we got to get people to where they work. The other side of that, though, is recognizing that there's a lot of communities that don't have the same opportunities. And it's not only focusing on the areas that already have those amenities, that already have that transit, but then also how do we then bring in, policies and investments to neighborhoods where we need to lift the opportunity, where we need to provide that walkability, where we need to be able to provide those opportunities. So there's sort of a twin side of that at the city that we work through. And then I would just mention kind of, beyond that kind of broad framework, I do think, the other thing is kind of focusing on the streetscape experience itself. And I think of that as, when people walk out their door in the morning, whether it's to go to work or whether it's to go to the local coffee shop, the streets, that environment, the public realm is one of the first and primary things that we interact with in our community. Yeah. And so just thinking about when you walk out, do you see street trees? Do you have sidewalks? Do you have curb ramps? How accessible is it? How friendly and safe does it feel to be in that environment and to be able to feel like you can choose to walk, to bike, and that you're safe and secure and that that's a viable and comfortable option. So part of that thought is, we focus a lot on the comfort of drivers and really reorienting it to think about the comfort and accessibility and safety of, the pedestrians first and foremost.
That's so critical. And I think if we learned lessons from this pandemic, I mean, some people had to work from home and had things in their neighborhood they could walk to and get to, and other people had to work from home and were secluded in spaces where they didn't have that. And then what happened to downtown when people started working from home? And obviously everybody didn't have that luxury to work from home, but I think the concept of complete and compact communities where people can walk around and have that experience definitely were highlighted, or the lack of it was highlighted for other people. I also think there's something to be said about community and safety in general when your community is more accessible by feet. Like some of the things that are happening in Tacoma and some of the things people are really concerned about are a result of people not being out, people not walking around neighborhoods, people not being connected to their neighborhoods in the same ways. Because after 2 years of being inside, that got harder and harder. And so I think, part of building community is about some of those things you were just talking about. And obviously your accessibility to transportation. It's funny, like you live different places in different regions of the country. Like nobody rode the bus in Dayton, but when it snowed, everybody rode the bus because that was easier, better, than trying to shovel out your car and then having to like fight with other people who don't know what they're doing in the snow. And so, we don't really have those same pushes here. And so that's just an interesting, me vamping on my thoughts as you were talking. So maybe it was just interesting to me. I do invite the audience to, if you have questions or comments, go ahead and put them, click the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen and put it in there. And if it fits into the conversation, I'll try to ask it while we're talking. If not, I'll get to it at the end. But Mariana, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, sure. I really agree with what Stephen was saying about like access and, having the option to bike or to walk or to use the bus. And I think that, a lot of people don't think of that choice as a real choice, but it's like a privilege. And depending on like where you live, if you're in a more housing dense area and you have access to those things, and it's because of the history of that area, and we go back to like racist exclusionary policies of where people were allowed to live that still have impacts today. That land use really ties into this question of like transit, because we're still grappling with the impacts of those racist policies that didn't let some people, didn't let Black and Indigenous and people of color to live in areas where it's safer, where there's more green spaces, where there's access to fresh produce. Food deserts are a really, really big problem in Tacoma. And so I think like we need to be talking also about like equity, this conversation. And yeah, I mean, I think that transit has become a really big conversation, especially with the work I do at the state level as well, with the transportation package that just passed, and how we have to shift, money and funds away from cars and away from roads and highways to more transit and like electric transit, not based on oil anymore. So yeah, there's so much that we could talk about in this question. I really love it. Thank you.
So Christy, I heard you talking when we were trying to, educate people about the climate action plan, about how none of these things should be separate, and how housing and building green and transportation and in electrification, like all of these things are better in general, like they all help each other. And so just when you think about this idea of like where transportation fits into this thing, and I think this is probably between you and Steve, like the conversations about parking spaces and how much access people should have to cars, and what does that mean for some people if we move away from that? Like, that's a hard thing for people who are car centric to even wrap their mind around. And, I could tell you 5-10 years ago when my kids were all playing sports and I was working a full-time job, and I was like, you want me to do that without a car? You are crazy. But now that I understand it a little better, I do realize that there are definite trade-offs. And maybe talk a little bit about what are those trade-offs, and what do we have to do as a community to make those trade-offs a little more accessible for people.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a hard one, but it is so essential that we work together on this. It's so key to so many things. We were talking as in our prep meeting, some of the cities that we love to go and visit are the ones where you're not renting a car in that city. You're getting around through their other transportation, and that's like, you pay money to go on vacation to these places to not have to get in your car. But we cannot expect people to give up their cars if there are no options for them. I mean, it's just not possible. I feel like a lot of families would love to maybe move down to one car, but they have to have those options to be able to take the bus or to bike or walk. And without that, they're really, I think, trapped into having that kind of impact costs, that go along with car ownership. So it is so essential that we continue this planning that makes it easier for people to have these other transportation options. At the city, like, we don't run the transit. We don't run Pierce Transit. We don't run Sound Transit. So there are partners that we work with. And just trying to make sure that the city's built infrastructure can support then those services to the maximum extent that they can serve and deliver buses, on fast routes and lots of routes and things like that, that we have to help design our city so everyone can have these, walkable neighborhoods where they can get to their essential services. It's just so important that we have that vision and continue putting, I think, policies and incentives into that kind of development so people have the options to ditch a car, as opposed to being stuck with having this infrastructure and costs that it's really, again, we talked a little bit about how much of our public land is dedicated to private vehicles, and just thinking about reimagining that if we had bigger sidewalks and more protected bike, that was less, I think. But again, it has to go hand in hand. You have to have that for people to feel like they could give up a car.
Yeah, I kind of think of it as a chicken and egg thing, and I know in places like Portland and some other cities, they've really done a good job of getting bus passes and things into the hands of young people so that you build a culture of I can get around. I mean, I have, nieces and nephews are I would never have a car. My daughter voluntarily gave up her car because she can get around in Seattle without it. And, my niece can get around Portland without a car. She just doesn't even have a driver's license. She's like, that's extra expense that I don't need. And so that kind of chicken and egg of you have to get to a certain point of accessibility for people to be willing to give up the other thing, but you also have to you have to have the things for people to be willing to give up the, you know what I mean? So it's a real interesting thing. And I think in our pre-conversation, Marquise, you had talked a little bit about, building that culture of people using transportation and being comfortable, and you want to jump in here and talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think my situation for my job is kind of is a great example, and it's probably pretty relevant now with the flex working. But it's I live 1.5 miles from my office. I go in 2 days a week because we're kind of in a flex, hybrid with COVID. And so for me to take transit into my 1.5 mile away work, it's a 40-minute bus ride, right? Where my drive is about 8 minutes, and my walk is actually 45, right? So it almost makes more sense for me to walk into work. I mean, well, obviously driving makes the most sense for time, right? But we have to have a lot of considerations. And then after that, it's basically like it's a gamble whether the bus or my walk is going to be fast, because I am a fast walker. I'm pretty tall. And so I think that kind of just illustrates we're in this predicament, right? People do not, I mean, I've only been in Tacoma for almost 3 years now, but people in Tacoma do not like the word suburb. And we're not a suburb, right? But we are built out kind of structurally like a dense suburb for the most part. I mean, we have some really, really walkable cores, right? I used to live off 6th Ave, now I'm in Hilltop. And that's the gambit, right? You just stroll down the street, you can get your food, you can get your groceries. I mean, well, it's not really grocery stores, but you can get like a lot of amenities stuff over there, right? And so we do have pockets that are really functional, but those are generally areas of privilege, right? And so that's a huge part of the conversation as well. And so I might be kind of transitioning to the next problem too, but I think we kind of have to, I think there's a lot of different strategies that we can use. And I think one of them is, right, is we need to have like we need to have a regional model, right? We need to be leaning into regional planning. Luckily, Stephen Atkinson does a lot of that. And so we need to be kind of collaborating across communities and municipalities to make sure that we're building out, because Tacoma is the hub of what is like there's a lot of suburbs around us that are directly reliant on Tacoma. And we kind of, in America, we very much like this kind of like hub and spoke model of transit. I don't know if it's brought up on this call or not, but basically, right, where we have the downtown cores or the business districts, depending on which city it is. And then it's basically out straight to the suburbs, right? And that model just doesn't work anymore. I don't think we actually had a different model up until really the 50s. And then we built we kind of did the second wave of our highway expansions. And then we got a lot of freeways and highways that cut through Black and brown communities. And so I think it's a paradigm shift, really. And luckily, I like being an environmentalist because I think we kind of have the blessing of, if you're keeping climate environment in mind, you are tackling a lot of different issues, right? If you're truly building sustainable communities, you're building dense transit connected communities. If you're truly building sustainable communities, those communities have to be moved around with low carbon transit, right? Which pushes people towards public transit, and also pushes people towards cleaner fuels or net zero fuels. And so, which we don't really have right now. Hydrogen though, we're getting there, right?
Right.
And so it's kind of how I think of it, as I don't know if folks have heard of like a health and all policies approach. Basically, it's where, when you're doing policy, especially at that really high state level, you really need to be looking at public health as one of the major factors that you're looking at. And so I think we kind of need a sustainability in all policies approach, and I think that will deal with a lot of these issues. But again, that doesn't kind of give you an off for not building really affordable housing in transit dense areas and making that part of the zoning, right? People are so afraid, especially, no offense to the business community, no offense to any business folks on here, are really afraid of rezoning and zoning classifications, because it changes the character of areas, right? Whether that's the industries that are there, whether that's the neighborhoods and the developments that can come up. And so we kind of have to get away from that too. And we have to start doing these planning processes farther out, so that we can get more people at the table, because I think there's a lot of sticker shock around oh my gosh, a 50-person apartment or a 50-unit apartment complex is can go up a couple blocks away from me. That changes things. And it's well, we've actually known we've needed to change for decades. And we don't want to push people out, right? That's what's hard about going green, right? Is greener areas, they have more parks, they have more transit access, usually they displace people. And so we need to be making these considerations decades in advance and planning decades in advance, so that we can kind of nip some of this in the bud.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in on displacement and some of the things you have to consider for those things not to happen. And I know we've talked about it in planning, and we've talked about it in the Home in Tacoma plan. And Steve, I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, no, I'll say, part of where my thoughts were going is, I think that, so long as housing is both a need and a commodity, that we're going to have this issue of affordability and accessibility. And what I would expect is, generally we need to be thinking that one of the outcomes of growth and development is likely, and I think this pattern is happening in other places, is a displacement of BIPOC communities and lower income communities from central cities that have a lot of those, the walkable kind of grid system and access to transit and a high quality of environment, to areas that are more suburban, that are more SOV dependent. And that's partly why I think, to Marquise's point about that regional planning, is if we're not going to be able to put a stop to that degree of shift and displacement, we need to work towards mitigating that within Tacoma. But that's also where we need other jurisdictions to really step up and also be working to address housing affordability, and improving that quality of life in their communities too. So I think that's where that regional planning framework really, we need everyone, kind of living up to those roles and responsibilities to make sure that the people are not being displaced from a community that values sustainability and a healthy environment to a place that doesn't provide, those basic, qualities.
Yeah.
So
And I think if we were proactive about it, we'd stop seeing the shift. I mean, the shift keeps happening, right? Like there was, everybody was in the city and then everybody fled out to the suburbs. And then they're like, oh, but the cool stuff is in the city. So now everybody, so it's back to the city. And then the people who can afford to stay there get pushed out. And if you created the larger grid system where you could live at any point in that mix and still get to the cool stuff, people would, because there are some people like me who always imagined I would live downtown somewhere and I would like walk home from work and pick up my groceries and I would not have to worry about a yard or any of the things associated with living in the suburbs, and that would be great for me. And I know other people that sounds like a nightmare life. Like they want to be far away from people. They would prefer not to have to like even see another house. And that's okay too, but they still want to go to the theater and they still want to go out to dinner in the city when they choose. And if we make it hard to do that, both groups lose out. And so, Mariana, like, what are your thoughts about that and displacement and the role? Like, because all of this all plays together, right? If all of your working class people who make a city work have to live far out, then you're talking about trips and cars and gas and all the other things. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought this point up because I think that, we were mentioning the pandemic and like, who are the folks who, kind of left the city because they could work from home, and the folks who can't afford the city and are essential workers in the city can't afford to live in the city. So it's like such a paradigm that is just so prevalent in the West Coast and, in big cities in the United States, is like the people who really need to be in these locations and because their work is there, like can't afford to live there, can't have to rely on single occupancy vehicles or have to take like 2 hours of bus lines to get to those places.
Right.
Even just like commuting from downtown Tacoma to Seattle, if you're not going to downtown Seattle, it will take you over an hour and a half. I've done it several times. I don't own a car and I'm proud of that, but it definitely makes life more difficult, and it makes me have to like time things a lot more. And we haven't even talked about like physical ability, and that's also another factor in with transit that we have to take into consideration is like disability. And there's some really amazing groups doing some advocacy work there. But all of that and like making sure that our transit is able to to accommodate those folks that need. I think I went around your question, but
no, I think you got to it. And I think, bringing up disabilities is also talking about aging in place. I mean, there's a point where, some senior folks, aren't able to drive anymore. And you couple, I can't drive anymore, plus housing prices are going up faster than my Social Security or whatever my fixed income is. So now, not only can I not afford to stay here, I can't get around to the places and things that I have always loved or been accustomed to. And like, I know for, not to offend anyone in the audience or anywhere else, but like, my mom is a boomer and losing her independence is probably the worst thing that could ever happen to her. And so, if you live someplace where you also then can't access good transportation and there's not places to downsize to, and now, my mom's in a 4-bedroom, 2-3 fireplace house that she can't take care of at 75 years old. And if you take her car away, then I mean, we're just like, I'm gonna have a whole mess on my hands. So y'all pray for me. But I'm just, you know, in the context of a community and thinking about how all these things play together, and how do you create a community where the, you know, the small family can upgrade into a bigger place, and the family that used to be a big family like mine, it now needs a smaller place, and you know, people can be free to make the choices that best suit where they are right now. Means you've got to have lots of options and choices, and sometimes that means sacrificing other things. So since we're visioning this beautiful world that we're going to create, and I'm going to start with Marquise. Like, what projects or policies do you hope to be implemented, or like that are you kind of rooting for to be implemented for Tacoma to be that community that we're talking about?
Yeah, so sorry, it was what projects and policies?
Yeah.
Well, obviously it's Tacoma Green New Deal. I think that'll solve all of our problems. But yeah, I'm trying to keep an eye as much as I can on, I think Steve already mentioned this, Home in Tacoma Phase 2. I think that's a really good tool in our toolbox and our policy repertoire, to kind of allow us to tackle a lot of those issues head on around zoning and how we want to have, you know, get more folks into certain areas. I mean, I think people are really, in some, probably not people on this call, but I think some folks are really afraid of, I kind of mentioned this earlier, like changing the character of a neighborhood. And I think there might be some dog whistles, I think, in some of that discourse as well, unfortunately. But what I do think is, like, we can look to models that work really well, right? Like Stadium mind you, it's expensive, and that's a consideration. We talked about displacement. Stadium is a great walkable neighborhood. And I love that there's family homes right next to these like apartment complexes that are made out of like brick, and they have like some fun name, like it's usually a little European name or something like that. And so like, I think we don't have to be afraid of these changes. And so I look into things like Home in Tacoma Phase 2, right, where we can do a lot of the work that we've been needing to do probably for decades. Obviously, I mentioned the Tacoma Green New Deal. Part of Communities for Healthy Bay, we're supporting a Tacoma Green New Deal, which is fun. It's kind of a new project of ours. We'll hear more about it soon. But one of the reasons we're doing that is because we know that transformative policy is really, it pushes on a lot of different areas. And so we're focusing on the sub-area plan, which I think has also been mentioned, right? About how do we have multiple governments collaborating on, doing not just things around transportation, but like, how do we attract green industry? How do we attract green manufacturing? How do we attract potentially like a maritime academy? Like, how do we do a lot of these things? How do we make those land use choices now so we can have a really like thriving and beautiful, area in society? And so I'm really looking at stuff like that kind of transforms at the scale of the issue. But I also think, focusing in on your one issue is really important. And I know a lot of folks on this call are probably either advocacy adjacent or really plugged into issues. And I think just taking your one thing and running with it and trying to become the most intersectional advocate you can, recognizing like it's kind of not your job to like advocate for every issue. I mean, like, it's nice, right? Like it is a privilege to be able to speak to a lot of different issues. But if you have a good understanding of the interconnections between issues, you can kind of be that extra pair of eyes when folks, like maybe frontline folks are not always going to be at the table, which is a shame and a disservice. But if you have kind of a justice perspective, you can help get them there. You can help speak to some of those issues. And so I think, those are kind of some of the things I'm looking at. Tacoma Green New Deal, sub-area plan, Home in Tacoma Phase 2. Those are all, I think, going to be really transformative for Tacoma in a way that I know is going to pay dividends, especially on the front of the climate crisis, right? When transportation is our largest section of emissions in Washington State, and then the other side of that, building energy and homes is the largest growing, right? And so we kind of have to tackle both of those if you really want to reduce our emissions.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think that what you said about being intersectional, like it can't be a zero-sum game or where you're like, I'm going hard on transportation at the cost of affordable housing, or I'm going hard on, this thing at the cost of, like, really it is going to take, and my 20-something kids are like, stop talking about incrementalism. I'm tired of incrementalism. But I think there is smart ways of being pragmatic about the things that we're implementing and supporting, so that we're not, it's not all or nothing. We have to do shifting versus just like shut it off here. There's some things we could shut off here and turn on here, but there are other things that need to be a little more, incremental. So, Christy, what are the projects or policies you want to see happen that you think will make the biggest inputs? Or
Well, when I think of policies, I think about some of the kind of bold investments that were made in the past that are helping me. Like I wasn't here. I moved here 20 something years ago, but I wasn't here 50, 100, even, 25 years ago when our city council decided to take on the Superfund liability, spend $100 million. People wanted to recall some of our council members for making this investment, but it was about for our future. So I just feel like so much of our policies needs to be thinking about not just Tacomans today, but like Tacomans in the future, because they are constituents and community members too, and they don't have a voice at all because they're not even here yet. But we need to be thinking about our policies and that time frame and making these decisions that are going to benefit, especially as our climate is more impacts are coming. We've got to be thinking about how can we protect future Tacomans from these impacts that are just going to be growing, and we can do that with some policies today. So I definitely agree. The home in Tacoma, we need more housing, we need more choices. I think I'm also excited about some of the recent state legislation that is going to be bringing dollars through the state's Climate Commitment Act, which is like the cap and invest, as well as the low carbon fuel standard, which is going to be incentivizing more low carbon fuels. And there's going to be funds that come down to local governments and local communities to make some of these investments, let alone the federal infrastructure dollars. So, it's looking about how are we prioritizing these influx of funds like we've never really had before for this work. How can we really be making sure that we're prioritizing those and, equitable, healthy and safe and sustainable ways, and thinking, decades in advance, not just Tacomans today.
Yeah, no, totally agree. Steve, and then I'm going to come to you, Mariana.
I just first want to say, thank you to Marquise for championing probably half of my bullet points on this. So when I think about this, I don't think about a specific, like capital project or trail project, although there's a lot of really great things happening in the city on that side. A lot of great, tremendous investments in, our non-motorized facilities and connecting bikeways, across the city. Tremendous strides from Tacoma Public Utilities on electrification. It's been great to see that really championed at the city. But I think, some of the opportunities I see in the next few years are sort of more big picture, like Marquise was talking about. We've got, when I was talking about vehicle miles traveled earlier and that jobs and housing disconnect, we've got, really two, major planning efforts and community conversations happening around the future of housing in our city. And Home in Tacoma Phase 2 is going to then look at, really a new structure for implementing that and really changing the conditions by which housing can be built in the city of Tacoma. The other side of that is, not just with the Tide Flat Suburban Plan, but conversations around the South Tacoma Manufacturing Industrial Center is to envision, what's the future of manufacturing and industry in the city of Tacoma. There's a lot of conversations around, protecting community health, but also part of community health is having access to employment. Yeah. And so that's, a really, going to be a significant component over the next 2 years of an opportunity to better align both our housing and our economic development vision. Yeah. So I think that's really going to be, I think, potentially setting the stage for the next 20 to 30 years of the city's, policy and vision and what develops and builds here. On the other hand, I kind of harken back to a comment earlier about fragmentation. We know the city doesn't provide all the services. We've got a lot of other partners and governmental agencies. And I would say, I think the next 2 years as well is a really unique opportunity to really better align our planning work with the work of those other agencies and governments. And that includes, both working with the Puyallup Tribe of Indians, to better align our planning with the tribe's vision for the reservation and for tribal lands. I would also say that there's really unique opportunities. This will be a little bit down in the weeds, but but the city has what we call a level of service standard for parks and recreation. So those standards are based on, if you live in Tacoma, how far from your house do you have to walk before you have access to a park?
Right.
And we have a different standard than Metro Parks Tacoma. And so those are like little things, but it also means that we don't have an alignment currently between, what the city's vision for park and recreation access is and Metro Parks. Similarly, I would just highlight with Pierce Transit, there's a lot of work going on the future of transit in Tacoma. And there's a shift really in thinking from, the light rail that we've seen with Sound Transit to bus rapid transit, and thinking about, what is the new level of service standard for transit in the city of Tacoma? How do we kind of meld bus rapid transit with the dense urban environment and make sure that becomes a comfortable, convenient first choice for Tacomans? So I look at it like the next 2 to 3 years is a pretty structural, like, Tunisia, I mean, you talk about, incrementalism versus a chance to really kind of reset, what that planning and that long-term vision in Tacoma looks like. So I think it's a really exciting, an exciting time in Tacoma.
Yeah. And I think like we really just got to not be afraid of what the future is going to bring and really just walk boldly into it, because I want to create a Tacoma where my kids want to stay here and want to have their kids here so that I don't have to get on a plane to see my grandkids. And I think, when that time comes for my family, like I want them to be able to choose Tacoma because it has the amenities and the things that make a city attractive to, my kids who might have different visions of what a community looks like than what I grew up knowing, and the kind of urban suburb that I grew up and that I grew accustomed to, that is probably not, what they're looking for in their future. So, Mariana, what are the policies and things that you're looking forward to or interested in?
Yeah, I think everyone has mentioned a lot of what I would echo. And then lastly, talking about statewide policy, I'm actually very sad to deliver the news that one of our key bills to add climate change as a goal of the GMA did not pass this session. But we are still working to, maybe and hopefully pass it next year. But that doesn't mean that climate change can't be a main lens in comprehensive planning. And I think that's what we get down to is like, you can advocate for these things at the local level as well. It doesn't mean that like you have to go through the state legislature to make sure these things are implemented. So I think organizing around it, talk to Marquis about a lot of the work that he does locally in Tacoma and how people can get involved, because I mean, not because this law didn't pass, it doesn't mean that we can't have this future for Tacoma. It does mean that it makes it a little bit harder for to get funds like for specific like climate resiliency and climate adaptation planning. But I think for Tacoma, there's a lot of people that really care. It's a really kind of like small community for organizing around these things. And I was also with Sunrise Tacoma, and I know there's a lot of young people that really want to see this future for Tacoma. So now taking my Sunrise Tacoma hat, putting it on, I also really want to echo the Tacoma Green New Deal. I worked with Marquis to put together listening sessions, and I think it's really inspiring to hear what people want in their community. Whether it's like, I just want like a park nearby that I can walk to and like exercise there, and I don't have to like take my car and drive to a national park that's like 2 hours away. Things like that, or just like, starting the process to transition our buildings out of the fossil fuel industry. So it's a really like intersectional platform, like Marquis was talking about. And it's not just about like one thing. I think it's like this really amazing like vision that we want to have for Tacoma and for other cities in Washington and in the United States and in the world. We want to be able to have this amazing future. And I would love to stay in this area to like keep having like a close job that I can work in and like not have a car and do all of those things. Yeah.
I think that's really, really important. And I think we just got to keep talking about that future so it becomes less and less scary for people who maybe haven't had the time, the bandwidth, the imagination to think about it, and not because for any other reason that our lives are hard and they've been hard over the last 2 years. But I think to Steve's point, like we've got some things that are just right on the verge of happening, and we're at a pivotal time in, in our country's history and in our community's history. And so I'm going to transition into the question of like, so where should people plug in? Who are the people they should be talking to? Where are the meetings they should be showing up for? What are the ways in which they should educate themselves so that they can help to create that future? And I'm going to start with you, Mariana.
Yeah. So like can you hear the
Oh, might be me. Hold on one sec.
Okay. Oh, yeah, that's better. Yeah, I think, I mean, as an organizer by nature, I will say that like getting involved, talking to your community, talking to your neighbors, getting involved in like your local neighborhood council, or joining CHB in their efforts, or you can become a volunteer with Sunrise if you're a young person, or with your, your school. I think that just like the power of like talking to others and starting to come together around issues that you really care about is really important. And in terms of like the question of like who are the decision makers, and I mean it's tricky because like a lot of these land use policies, like a lot of people have mentioned, aren't like implemented or aren't decided on by just one government, right? It's not just like city of Tacoma. It's not just like Pierce County or Pierce Transit. It's like there's so many different jurisdictions, and so it's hard to power map and see like, okay, who actually has the power, and I'm still figuring that out. I'm like, is it just Governor Inslee? I don't, like, do you have to go all the way to the top? But yeah, so I think that's a hard question for me to answer. But maybe folks in City of Tacoma have a better answer. I will say that Pierce County has their comprehensive plan due, and there will be some opportunities for public comment this year. So if you want to get involved in that, that's some folks in the chat were like, HB 1099 can be implemented locally. You're right. If you want to implement it locally, you can go give public comment and make sure that they're putting climate action, climate adaptation in the comprehensive plan.
Marquise, we're going to try to, we have lots of questions and good questions, so I want to get to them. So Marquise, what's your advice for people to get involved, and who do they need to be talking to?
Serendipitous, because I just dropped some links in the chat. Yeah, I think a great place to start, and I would wager most people know who their county, city, and state, and even member of Congress. Like I imagine most people on this call know that chain of power or chain of influence, or know who it is, I should say. But I think always connecting with them is a really great starting point, even if it's just like a Zoom conversation where like you don't have to jump into the belly of the beast, being in like an issue advocate or being like or doing electoral work. Like I think it's just like getting to know who it is that represents you and knowing their priorities. I think is a great conversation piece, because even if that's the only meeting you ever have, you're going to inherently instill your values and your priorities to someone you voted for, or hopefully you voted for them. Right, fingers crossed that you voted in the election, but it's not everyone can vote, so that's also a consideration. But I think knowing who represents your area is really important. So I think that's a great first step too, because like, yeah, again, people don't always have the time to engage in a lot of issues, but if you can at least know who it is that is pulling on the levers of power, you can at least have some kind of access to decision making. And unfortunately, we don't. We're kind of in this. America's kind of in this funny spot where we're like, we have a representative democracy, but there's a lot of areas where it could really be improved. And so it's hard, right? It's hard. We don't have like like in Portland, there's this thing called, I know we're trying to be fast, this thing called Metro, and it's like the first regionally elected government in the United States, which is a thing that's not really, it's not a thing in America, right? And so, you know, we unfortunately don't have tools like that. So unfortunately, you do kind of have to go to each different, you know, level of government and advocate there. But I think just having a good read on what are the priorities for your community, and, you know, leading with that, even if it's conversations at the coffee shop with your boss, or if it's, you know, if you're at, like, I don't know, a bake sale, right? Like, just like knowing what's going on in your community, I think allows you to engage in a way that's natural, right? Even if you can't jump in on every issue.
Yeah, I think, like I said, being that intersectional advocate, and when you see the opportunity, saying what you see and sharing your story, because that's the thing that sticks. You know, I can say, as someone who works closely with our council, like, when people have individual conversations with them, whether you think they hear you or not, they do hear you. And those things come back up in the conversations. Well, so this business person had this experience, or this mom had this experience, or I was talking to a lady the other day and she couldn't find housing, or a guy missed an interview because he missed the bus. And they're thinking about how they can impact those things. So just even those little conversations are influential, and probably more influential than you might think. Steve?
Yeah, and I appreciate Marquise putting the, you know, the contacts up here for, you know, finding your council member. I mean, it's usually, you know, for the work that we do locally, through long range planning, I think it's an important distinction that you know, permit decisions at the city of Tacoma are generally administrative, and so those are decisions that are usually sort of planning director decisions. You know, site rezones, things like that, are generally go through the hearings examiner. And so there are a variety of those ways. But when we talk about sort of the broader policy and goals of the city, and the development regulations, those are all legislative processes. And so those are all things that are, you know, include pretty broad and extended public engagement processes that involve planning commission review and go to the city council. So almost all the work that I do ends up going, at the end of the day, it's the city council. It's the decision-making body over the city's comprehensive plan, our land use codes, capital facilities programming. So that's a document that outlines, like, how do we want to invest over the next 6 years in things like community centers or public facilities? What are our service needs? What, you know, funding do we have available, and how are we going to spend that? So for me, that's kind of the key thing there. Is planning staff are usually kind of the front lines for the community. You know, contacting us is usually a really good place to start. And we have a lot going on, so we know that can be difficult to kind of track when there's a lot happening at the city, kind of where to even start. And so planning staff are usually a good place to start and can kind of help orient folks. Second is kind of understanding, you know, the citizen boards and commissions that we've got, and the role of the planning commission. I will say there have been times where, you know, we have neighborhood representation, as well as different sort of subject matter experts on the commission. And there have been times where it's been challenging to get, you know, representation from the east side of Tacoma or South Tacoma. So that those kinds of opportunities entail a lot of, you know, volunteer time, but it really puts you at the heart of, you know, evaluating and recommending, you know, a path forward on a lot of these just really challenging and complex issues. And so the Planning Commission is, you know, also another one that is available for public comment and public process. So kind of with that said, but I would also just echo, I think, the comment that Mariana made about the countywide planning policies. Like, in terms of the things that kind of most directly affect us, that's the other one I would point to as, you know, if there are things that you're concerned about in Tacoma, then you should be concerned about what's happening, you know, with the county and the countywide planning policies. And so that's sort of the county's plan to address things like housing affordability and livability at a county-wide scale. And since that's the thing that most affects us living in Pierce County, that's something else that I would really emphasize as a point of involvement.
Thank you, Steve. Christy?
Yeah, and I mean, there's not really that much more to share. There are so many options to get involved. That is the great part about it. And I guess what I would also say is that if you feel like intimidated to like apply to be on one of these boards, or to contact an elected, like, do it. Like, it's not, everyone else who's on it, who's done it, also felt the same way. And now they're like, yeah, I got it. And it may feel like, I don't quite know what to do the first meeting or two, but like, ask a buddy. That's what like, CHB is like happy to like help. Downtown on the Go does all this like training and budding on how to have these conversations or jump in and apply. So there's so many options. And if you feel like I'm not an expert in this, that's okay. Most people are not. And so don't be intimidated, I think, by not feeling like you know everything 100% before you volunteer or have some conversations.
All right, we're going to jump into these questions because we got a lot of them. I don't think we're going to get to all of them. So I'm just going to start at the top. So what changes would be required to reframe increased public transportation from within the city of Tacoma needs versus getting folks to Seattle work? You know, like what needs to happen to shift so that we can get both and, you know, because there's a lot of people that come from the south suburbs into Tacoma. There's a lot of people that go to Tacoma, from Tacoma to Seattle, and that all needs to work together. But how do we shift and talk specifically about the needs of Tacoma? And I don't know if Mariana or Steve, I don't know which one of you or whoever wants to jump on in. Let's talk about it. Well, Steve, it's you. Go ahead.
No, these are tough sometimes as a city staff person, kind of like how to reframe, you know, that conversation. And, you know, to some degree, I think it's there's sort of two different things going on. And one is we are trying to integrate as a region so that we're, you know, even as traffic gets worse in the future, that folks can still feel like you can move around and have that freedom to go to other parts of the region and have that accessible to us. So I think generally that's sort of thought of as kind of the general spine of kind of getting, you know, the region connected, having that basic framework in place. But also, you know, I think to someone's point too about creating compact, complete, and connected neighborhoods within the city, that there's that common theme. And I still think of it as, you know, the same policy we have at the region about integrating different communities together via transit is the same that we have as a community, in whether it's city in our suburbs or city in our neighborhoods. And that idea that, because I've heard people in Seattle say, you know, the drive I used to take to go to dinner, you know, from Capitol Hill to Ballard used to be, you know, 15 minutes, and now it takes me an hour. And there are some aspects that, yeah, we want to be able to maintain that connectivity both within the city and within the region. So I think there's a common theme there that isn't an either or theme, but recognizes that we need both. Yeah,
Totally agree. There's a comment in here that, you know, if local transit is accessible and frequent, kids can get themselves to their events at certain ages, and most people will be surprised about what's possible, and kids are more independent than we assume, and that's so true. And it, you know, it's really funny if you go, you know, if you've been to New York, you'll see like little kids with like their helmets and training wheels riding their bikes like on the streets of Manhattan, like in with like thousands of people, because they're acclimated to that environment. And so being in a busy downtown is just part of their life, and it's part of the trade-off of living in New York, you know. And I think the same way, you know, if kids could, then I know Tacoma Public Schools did some good stuff about getting, you know, kids, you know, bus transportation, and TPU as part of the electrification of some of the vehicles. And I think just doing more of that, because like I said, you know, I have nieces and nephews that are like, why would I ever buy a car? That's like $500. And, you know, my daughter made a trade-off of like car in a small dingy apartment or a nicer apartment with security and no car, because for her, the security was more important than having, you know, being in an older building without security. And so I think, you know, all those kinds of trade-offs. What are the strategies or initiatives that can help tackle the disparity of time poverty for marginalized groups? How can those be communicated and shared with the community? And I think that's speaking to the questions of like, if you have to spend 2 hours of your day waiting for a bus, that's 2 hours that me, you know, Marquise, like that trade-off between the 45 minutes to walk or the 8 minutes. And how do we communicate that better for that? So Marquise, Mariana.
Yeah. Sorry, will you give me like a summary? Because I heard kind of two parts of it. I want to make sure.
Yeah, that's me vamping again. So like, how do we do a better job of telling that story about the time and the trade-offs that people have to give between, when you're lower income, you either pay in time or you pay in resource.
Dollars. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think a great tool is storytelling, and a great tool is making sure we're actually having like accountable relationships with frontline communities. And so that's something that's always a challenge when you're in these spaces, right? Right. I'm a person of color, but I'm in a field that generally it's like you have to kind of be somewhat privileged to be an advocate, right? And so I think always make sure we have accountable relationships with frontline communities is especially important, right? And like, the city is growing into its own in terms of like having like accountable relationships like the Puyallup Tribe, right? Like they're a co-partner in regional planning now at the sub-area level. And so I think that's one tool is like we have to recognize the land we're on. We have to recognize a lot of the wealth that this country was built off of comes from frontline communities and how it was taken from them. And on the other front too, we have to be telling those stories, right? Like, right, some days I can come to the office like a little bit late. So like, yeah, I can walk in. It's not a big deal, right? I can come in at 9:45 if I don't want to like have to get up at 7 to get to the office. But that is a privilege. And so I think having honest and real accountable conversations around how privilege impacts our land use decisions and impacts infrastructure specifically, I think is one of the best ways we tackle that too. But yeah, I don't have an easy fix other than like we just have to be kind of pushing on a lot of things at once and hoping that small incremental change, right? Like, on a wide surface area, we'll push us towards communities that are livable for folks. Because I think it's kind of funny. Like I live in a community that's kind of like halfway between. I mean, I live in central Tacoma, right? And so it's like it's more affluent than other parts, but it's not as affluent as other parts. And I really do see like the shift. Like it's like if you go a straight line, right? Like it's straight line into like communities that are super walkable and super livable and all these things, and they're majority white, right? And our more diverse parts of the city are kind of on the edges, kind of in pockets. And so I don't know, I feel like I'm at a nexus in that too. And so it's really interesting seeing the kind of disconnects that create this kind of, create these areas where it's not as easy to live your life in certain parts of this town on a number of fronts.
Yeah, no, I think that's real. I saw one of the comments. I'm going to try to find it real quick, but it was talking about the idea of like, how do we create kind of more walkable spaces? And I think Christy, you referred to like, we go visit places that you can walk all day and see all kinds of things. What are some of the things that we could do around like the brewery district, or like we shut down Broadway for the farmers market, but we don't really think about those types of strategies other times to make walking more of a habit and accessing the businesses more of a habit here. So Christy, do you have any ideas about that or thoughts about that?
Well, and again, a lot of it is deciding how we're going to invest this public land. I think, having some, design standards for new development that really is creating that kind of atmosphere where people want to spend time outside and it feels safe to do so, to get there through, walking, good bus stops, biking, the scooters, all that, where we really need to create that appealing and safe infrastructure. And sometimes that means not prioritizing private vehicles again, if that's, and I think our city has been slow to make some of these changes where roads are closed down or roads are narrowed to create some of this other space for different uses, different public uses. But I think that's, really what it's going to take. A lot of, during the pandemic, a lot of cities shut down streets and they're making it permanent.
Yeah.
We didn't so much.
Yeah.
And we're not. So there's just, I think opportunities because other cities are doing it. It's not like they had the magic. Well, they had this, so they were able to do it. Like when you go back and, even Copenhagen and others, you learn like what they were 40, 50 years ago. They didn't have this like blank slate to start with. They were more car dominated and everything. And it's just been decades of prioritization have changed their landscapes.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because that also happened during the pandemic. Restaurants needed more outside space. And so certain cities like took all the parking and made that extensions of restaurants. And it was really cool. Like in those cities that did it, it was really cool. And they didn't lose anything from it. Like it wasn't like the restaurants were less full or anything like that. It just was a paradigm shift that they were forced into. And those are the things that I hope people are remembering about the pandemic, so that this last 2 years was just not for like a really bad experience where lots of people died and lots of families were disrupted, but instead like we learned lessons about seeing blue skies again and animals we hadn't seen before. And we also realized that we could live in our communities a little bit different. There's a question about housing needs and tree canopy. And I think this is a really good one. And I don't know, Steve or Christy, which one of you want to address it, but like, as we're building more houses, how are we balancing that, the needs of home in Tacoma and our need to increase tree canopy in the city of Tacoma, especially in certain areas?
Yeah, and I can speak to this shortly and then see if Christy has anything that she'd like to add. But, I think that there's certainly a relationship between the type of housing. If you go downtown, you can have zero lot line housing or, construction, which means, basically they're going to be building out, or they can build out to the full property lines. And, in those circumstances, that's going to be very different than a housing type in a neighborhood where you're building, an ADU in the back, but you still have a lot of yard space, that can accommodate new trees and new tree canopy. I do want to just say though, like a lot of so we do have standards on tree canopy, we have standards on landscaping, we do have standards on street trees. But generally it's always worth a caveat that our standards come into play with new development. And so, if you go look at a parking lot in the city of Tacoma that was built 40 years ago, there will probably be no trees in that parking lot, and there'll probably be no, dedicated walkways so that people can walk not in traffic in the parking lot to get to the building. Right. That is very different than with the current standards. But if you just walk around the city, you might not necessarily know that that's the difference or what those standards are. So I think that is kind of an important consideration that we have. Requirements currently when new housing development is built, we require anywhere from 20 to 30% tree canopy on site. But again, it's different depending on the different types of housing in different places within the city. We do have policies supporting acquisition, retention, and restoration of open spaces that we do have. So we have a lot of capacity within the city with an existing slopes and open spaces and critical areas to enhance the tree canopy we already have. And we have a lot of public right-of-way. And that's one of the biggest potential opportunities is the tree canopy in the right-of-way. And it's been an interesting finding in some other places. I think this is something that came out of Seattle where tree canopy was growing, was often correlated to where new development was happening. We've probably all known a single family homeowner that didn't like the pine needles dropping on their roof, and they go out and they cut the tree down. Yeah. Or you want to put in a vegetable garden and you want to get, rid of that shade so you can grow veggies. And yet new development is often going to be held to their planting. Now there are the circumstances I think somebody raised around, loss of tree canopy on site. And those are things that we also address, to some degree through standards for redevelopment. But it's complex, but that we do have those standards in place.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just say one of the things that we are looking to bring forward to the city council is some tree protection ordinances. Right now, you could virtually cut down any tree wherever you wanted, few limited exemptions. So no protections for heritage trees, really large trees. And so I think that's part of it, but also, acknowledging that there are other cities in our region that are more dense and have higher tree canopy. So I think it is definitely possible. And we just have to be smart and really proactive about where we're planting and then maintaining those streets.
Yeah, sure. I think we have time for one more question, and then I'm going to send it back over to Laura. But Tacoma has a propensity to push for one-to-one on-street parking replacement during major public work projects, including bike, ped, and transit projects. We're going to have a hard time moving the needle as a city on transportation emissions as long as we continue to prioritize the storage of personal vehicles over safe bike, ped, transit facilities. How do we change the city's prioritization? And are there things happening to change that? And maybe, Mariana, if you know things that are happening at the state level, they think also sometimes people think it's just like the city of Tacoma is not doing it, but there's some things we can't do because we don't control the resources that are coming to do some of the things that we're trying to do. So
Yeah, that's a great point. And, you know, for so many decades, and it's always been about like funding, streets for cars, funding highways. And yeah, I mean, if the city doesn't have the money to put these in place, they can't do it. And the other part I think is cultural, and it's like people are, and we've been talking about this, just like people prioritizing car culture over biking, over biking infrastructure. And I think it's like moving that culture, and like also talking about how this infrastructure doesn't have to damage and doesn't have to displace. And again, we've been talking about this, but I remember reading a really cool statistic of just how like increasing walking infrastructure and biking infrastructure on a street where there is, you know, restaurants, and can really increase economic development, and it makes people stop, and it makes people go into the shops. And I was just responding to someone else who had the same question about like the open streets, and just like it would just feel so much more safe if, you know, I was like walking and there's like a big path for me to walk, and I'm not walking where the bike is going. And, you know, a lot of like the culture of like, oh, like pedestrians hate bikers because they're going so fast, and a lot of times like they're going on the street on the where people are walking, right? But it's just we don't have the infrastructure to make it safe, and like then accidents happen. And if we did, then we could have like designated infrastructure for bikes to be safe around pedestrians, and for pedestrians to feel safe around cars and bikes. So yeah, I mean, I think that at the state level, there's definitely like the funding question. I think the biggest part, and also the cultural piece of like moving that. And Christy was talking about that with how it doesn't have to be like, oh, but like culturally, like we're just such a car driven country, but it's like, you know, other places were too, and now they're in a different spot. So it is doable.
yeah. Well, I think I'm only giving Laura 1 minute of time. I could talk to you guys forever. I have like 100 more questions and 100 more things I want to say, but I just want to thank each one of you for joining us today, and having just a really, really lively and informational conversation. So thank you for that. And Laura, I'm sorry that we took more time than we were supposed to. I guess you get to say goodbye really quick. So.
No, that was awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. I want to echo Tunisia and say thank you to the panelists for sharing your time, your expertise. That was a really awesome conversation, and I'm so glad we got to have that today. And thank you so much to Tunisia for moderating not just today's conversation, but all of the other forums that we had this year. I think this was a really great set of forums for 2022. And I'm so grateful for Tunisia every year for coming and making these conversations really like sparkle. She really brings the magic of what makes these work. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone in the audience. Those were some incredible questions as well. Like really detailed, really like high engagement questions. And I am so grateful for those. Whether this was your first forum of the year or you came to all three of them, Thank you for being here with us. Okay, couple of closing things. I know we're at time, but I want to let you all know that Downtown on the Go is bringing back our Walk Tacoma series in person this year, starting in just 2 weeks, I think, with a tour of new downtown businesses. That'll be on April 6th. There's more info on our website, but we're going to be back walking around Tacoma in person together. So stoked. A recording of this forum is going to be available on our social media accounts. If you enjoyed this conversation, we encourage you to share it with your friends who couldn't be in attendance today. And last, these events are free to attend, but they're not free for us to put on. So we ask that if you enjoyed today's forum, you consider supporting our work with a donation. You can find more information at downtownonthego.org, and we'll go ahead and end it there. Thank you so much, everybody. Great series of forums. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting us. Thanks for watching.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
Happy Friday.